Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and looked across the sunlit living room where little Emma sat in her favorite blue chair. The child wore bright green headphones and clutched a small wooden toy close to her chest. Through the tall windows, Margaret could see the vast gardens that stretched beyond the marble fountains and perfectly manicured hedges of the Harrison estate. At 62, Margaret had worked as a nanny for many families, but none quite like this one. Charles Harrison was one of the wealthiest men in the county, and his 8-year-old daughter Emma lived in a world of privilege that most people could only imagine. Yet something about the little girl tugged at Margaret's heart in a way that went beyond her usual professional care. Emma rarely spoke, and when she did, it was barely above a whisper. Her father Charles believed his daughter was deaf and had surrounded her with the finest specialists money could buy. Expensive hearing aids sat unused on her bedroom dresser, while sign language tutors came and went with little success. The child seemed to drift through her days in a bubble of silence that no amount of wealth could penetrate. Margaret had been caring for Emma for 3 months now, and she noticed things. The way Emma's eyes would follow the sound of birds singing outside her window, how she would turn slightly when Margaret hummed old lullabies while folding laundry. The child wasn't deaf, Margaret was certain of it, but something else entirely was keeping Emma locked away from the world. Charles Harrison was a man driven by success and achievement. His phone calls echoed through the mansion at all hours discussing business deals and financial strategies. When he spoke to Emma, it was with the same efficient tone he used with his employees, brief and to the point. He provided everything money, could buy expensive toys, educational programs, and the finest medical care, but Margaret wondered if he had ever simply sat with his daughter and listened. One afternoon, while Charles was away on business, Margaret sat on the floor beside Emma's chair. The little girl was playing with her building blocks, arranging them in careful patterns. Margaret began to tell stories about her own childhood, growing up on a farm with 6 brothers and sisters. She spoke softly about summer evenings catching fireflies and winter mornings when frost painted pictures on the windows. As she spoke, Margaret noticed Emma's hands had stopped moving. The child sat perfectly still listening, though she gave no outward sign. Margaret continued her gentle storytelling, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Emma began to lean toward her voice. Days passed, and Margaret established a quiet routine. Each morning after Charles left for his office, she would sit with Emma and share memories from her own life. She talked about her late husband, Robert, and how they had met at a church social when they were both 18. She described the small house they had shared for 40 years and the garden where they had grown tomatoes and sunflowers. Together, Emma never responded with words, but Margaret felt a connection growing between them. The child's posture softened when Margaret spoke, and sometimes she would reach out to touch Margaret's hand during particularly emotional stories. One morning, Margaret was dusting the mantelpiece when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was Emma humming softly a melody Margaret had sung the day before. The child was alone in the garden, visible through the French doors, and she was humming while arranging flowers she had picked. Margaret's heart filled with understanding. Emma could hear perfectly well, but somewhere along the way she had chosen silence. Perhaps it was easier than trying to connect with a father who was always rushing to the next meeting, or maybe she had simply never felt safe enough to use her voice. That evening, when Charles returned home, Margaret asked to speak with him privately. They sat in his oak-paneled study, surrounded by leather-bound books and certificates of achievement. Margaret chose her words carefully, knowing this conversation could change everything for Emma or cost Margaret her job. She told Charles what she had observed and heard. She explained gently that Emma wasn't deaf, but rather seemed to be protecting herself through silence. Charles listened with the same focused attention he gave to business presentations, but Margaret could see something shifting in his expression. The next morning, Charles did something unprecedented. He called his office and canceled all his morning meetings. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as father and daughter sat together on the garden bench. Charles had left his phone inside, and for the first time in months he gave Emma his complete attention. They sat in silence for a long while. Charles seemed uncertain how to begin this new kind of conversation with his daughter. Finally, he started talking about his own childhood and the father he had rarely seen because of work demands. His voice carried across the garden, soft and vulnerable, in a way Margaret had never heard before. Emma listened with the same stillness she showed during Margaret's stories. Charles talked about missing his wife Emma's mother, who had died when Emma was just 3 years old. He spoke about his fear of failing as a father and how work had become his way of avoiding the pain of loss. As the morning progressed, Margaret saw Emma's posture begin to change. The little girl moved closer to her father on the bench. When Charles paused in his storytelling, Emma did something remarkable. She began to speak. Her voice was small and clear like water over stones. She told her father about the dreams she had, about her mother and how she remembered the lullabies her mother used to sing. She talked about feeling invisible in their big house and how Margaret's stories made her feel less alone. Charles listened with tears in his eyes as his daughter's words poured out like rain after a long drought. Emma told him about the birds she watched from her bedroom window and the flowers she liked to pick in the garden. She said she had been afraid to speak because she didn't want to make him sad or take him away from his important work. Margaret wiped her own tears as she watched father and daughter discover each other for the first time in years. Charles gathered Emma into his arms and promised her that nothing in his work would ever be more important than these conversations with her. In the days that followed, Charles restructured his entire life. He worked from home more often and established a new routine of morning talks with Emma in the garden. He put away his phone during their time together and really listened to what his daughter had to say. Margaret watched their relationship bloom like the flowers Emma loved to tend. The child who had been silent for so long became a chatterbox, sharing observations about everything from the way clouds moved across the sky to the different sounds the house made at night. Emma's voice grew stronger each day as she discovered the joy of being heard and understood. She asked her father endless questions about his work, and he found ways to explain complex business concepts in terms an 8-year-old could grasp. Their conversations became the highlight of both their days. The expensive specialists and therapists were quietly dismissed. There had been nothing wrong with Emma's hearing, and now there was nothing wrong with her voice either. She had simply needed someone to create a safe space where she felt valued and heard. Margaret's role in the household evolved too. No longer was she just a caretaker, but rather a bridge between father and daughter. Charles often asked her advice about connecting with Emma, and Margaret shared the wisdom she had gained from decades of caring for children. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sit with Emma and they would continue their storytelling tradition. But now Emma contributed her own stories about school and friends and the adventures she imagined for herself. The child's imagination flourished in the warmth of genuine attention and love. One afternoon, Charles found Margaret in the kitchen preparing Emma's favorite snack of apple slices with cinnamon. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work with the same gentle care she brought to everything involving his daughter. He thanked Margaret, not just for uncovering Emma's ability to speak, but for teaching him how to listen. Margaret smiled and reminded him that Emma had always been capable of communication. She had just needed someone to believe in her and create the conditions where she felt safe to try. As autumn arrived, the Harrison house felt completely transformed. Laughter echoed through rooms that had once been silent. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator, and her chatter filled the dinner table. Charles discovered that his daughter was not only capable of hearing and speaking, but was remarkably intelligent and creative. Emma began attending a regular school, where she quickly made friends and excelled in her studies. Her teachers were amazed by her rapid progress and her enthusiasm for learning. At home, she would regale Charles and Margaret with stories about her day, animated and excited about sharing her experiences. The bond between Emma and her father grew stronger each month. They developed special traditions like Saturday morning pancakes and evening walks around the estate. Charles learned to see the world through his daughter's eyes and found wonder in things he had overlooked for years. Margaret watched their transformation with deep satisfaction. She had seen many children struggle to find their voice in various circumstances, but Emma's journey had been particularly meaningful. The little girl who had hidden behind silence had blossomed into a confident, articulate child who brought joy to everyone around her. Years later, when Emma was grown and successful in her own right, she would care